So today I'm going to give you a tour of one of my bookcases. This bookcase includes unread novels, non-fiction, books set in antiquity, poetry and short story collections, so I hope you enjoy. First we have my little antique vintage second-hand copy of Sherlock Holmes Mysteries. This is the third book of Sherlock Holmes stories. I just got this at a little antiques fair a couple of years ago. And yeah, underneath my scrapbook here we have some Puffin children's books. So we have Emile and the Detectives, we have The Never Ending Story, Chinese Cinderella, and Watership Down, The Beast That Is. Then I have a collection of vintage classics, above which I have my Tolkien treasury, inside of which are 4 small pocket-sized books written by J.R.R. Tolkien. That includes Rover Random, Farmer Giles of Ham, Smith of Wootton Major, and Tom Bombadil. Then, like I said, a collection of vintage classics. We have Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Anne Bronte the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and then a collection of Jane Austen's work, including Mansfield Park, Northanger Abbey, and Emma. And then on this side I have the only 2 Everyman classics I own. The first one is Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, and then the second is a special edition of Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, which includes all 3 books, Northern Lights, The Subtle Knife and The Amber Spyglass, and it has lovely stars on the spine. In saying that, this red book is actually published by Everyman as well, and it is a children's book called The Eagle of the Ninth. I then have another antique book here, and that is Once Upon a Time Children's Stories from the Classics, and this is just a gorgeous collection of sort of Greek myths for children with lovely coloured illustrations, but it's very old. I got that in an antiques fair. Then my Folio Society books. So I have Robert Graves' The Golden Fleece, which looks like that. I have Short Stories from the Strand, which looks like that. I have The Little White Horse, which is the only new Folio Society book I have, which looks like that. And then The Greek Myths by Robert Graves, which comes in 2 volumes, and they both look like this. And that brings us to the first shelf on this bookcase, and these are all of my unread novels, so I can't really say whether any of them are good or not, but they include Angela Carter's The Magic Toy Shop, The Constant Nymph by Margaret Kennedy, Forks and Crick by Margaret Atwood, Surfacing by Margaret Atwood, The Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Susan, Heat Glove by Catherine Dunn, The Book of Strange New Things by Michelle Faber, The First Bad Man, a novel by Miranda July, All Dogs Are Blue by an author whose name I am not about to butcher, Bret Easton Ellis and Other Dogs. And then right next to that I actually have American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, Boy Snowbird by Helen Oyeyemi, A Whole Life by Robert Seathaler, A Maggot by John Fowles, and lastly just in frame is Bitter Greens by Kate Forsyth. And above all of those, you might have seen, was this copy of The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This is published by Rhodes. And then on the rest of the shelf we have A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Amir McBride, Arthur and George by Julian Barnes, a tiny little Pushkin Press book called Chateau d'Argol by Julian Gracque, Beyond Black by Hilary Mantel, Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, How to Be Both by Ali Smith, The Book Collector by Alice Thompson, Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, Human Acts by Han Kang, and lastly a bind up of the Gormenghast trilogy by Peake. Then we come to the second shelf on this bookshelf, which is all of my short story collections and my poetry books. I think there's also a couple of plays mixed in there, but you'll see them as we come to them. This is a mixture of read and haven't read. First we have A Wild Swan and Other Tales by Michael Cunningham, and this is a retelling of traditional fairy tales. We then have Witchcraft in the Harem by Elia Whiteley, which is a collection of kind of fantastical horror short stories. Then we have Jellyfish by Janice Galloway, which is a collection of, I believe, kind of realistic short stories. I haven't read this one yet, but I'm excited to. Then comes Ali Smith's Public Library and Other Stories, which is a collection of short stories by Ali Smith, all about
books and libraries and borrowing books. And then probably the collection of short stories I've owned for the longest, since I've had this since I was a child. This is The Folk Tales of Scotland by Nora and William Montgomery. This book, without a title on it, is actually a proof copy of What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi. We then have Exo Orpheus 50 New Myths, which is sort of adaptations, retellings, reinterpretations of 50 ancient myths, edited by Kate Bernheimer and all written by different authors. We then have the Fairy Tales of Hermann Hesse, and these are German fairy tales. We then have the Penguin Book of British Short Stories. This again is a bit of a proof art copy. It's just a small selection of a much larger book published by Penguin, which have kind of famous authors' stories from throughout the years collected together. Then have Bluebeard's Egg by Margaret Atwood. We then have New World Fairy Tales by Cassandra Parkin. These are absolutely beautiful. I thoroughly enjoyed this collection. We then have Robert Aikman's The Wine Dark Sea, which is a collection of short horror stories. Above the books I also have these two, which are published by Le Figue Press, and this one's a collection of poetry called Things to Do with Your Mouth by Divya Victor, and then The Evolutionary Revolution by Lily Huang, and this one is kind of like experimental flash fiction-y kind of novel. Sounds a bit weird, I haven't read it yet. Then we have Treats by Lara Williams, which is a collection of short stories about being in your 20s and living in the 21st century. Then we have Yellow Cake by Margot Lanigan. We then have Julie Oringer's How to Breathe Underwater, another collection of more realistic short stories, which talks about childhood. We have Caris Bray's Sweet Home, which is a collection of short stories that deals with families and relationships and motherhood and children and loss. We then have Kirsty Logan's The Rental Heart and Other Fairy Tales, and although I haven't read this one, I've read Kirsty Logan's other collection of short stories and thoroughly enjoyed it. We then have Karen Russell's Vampires in the Lemon Grove, which I haven't read this yet, but I hear amazing things about Karen Russell. We then have Edgar Allan Poe's The Murder in the Rue Morgue, which are a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin tales, which was his kind of detective. We then have this tiny book, which is Some 40 Tales from the Afterlives by David Eagleman. And here's where we move on to the poetry and a couple of plays, like I mentioned. So first I have Ted Hughes' poems selected by Simon Armitage, A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare, a collection of Sappho's poem translated by Mary Bernard, love this edition. Unicorn, which is the poetry of Angela Carter, Ali Smith's The Seer, a collection of poetry by Joe Shapcott called Of Mutability. These next few are all favourite editions. Then we have a collection of poetry by Jack Underwood called Happiness, then a collection by Don Patterson called Orpheus, a version of Rilke, which are actually sort of rewritten versions of poetry written by Rilke. I haven't read this collection yet because I haven't read the original, but Don Patterson is one of my favourite poets. We then have a collection of Ted Hughes poetry called Crow from The Life and Songs of the Crow. Then another play, Cloud 9 by Carol Churchill. Black Roses, The Killie of Sophie Lancaster, which is a kind of like dedicated poetry collection by Simon Armitage. Carol Ann Duffy's Love Poems. Brand New Ancients by Kate Tempest, which I enjoyed but not as much as my other collection of Kate Tempest's poetry. We then have Michael Rosen's Fighters for Life selected poems. Michael Rosen is another of my favourite poets. We then have Tongu. We then have a copy of Ajax by Sophocles. The next book isn't really poetry, it's Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter, but it is a kind of semi-poetical, lyrical prose novel based on Crow by Ted Hughes, so I decided to keep it in here. We then have Cady Benion's Milk Fever. There Are No Americans in Baghdad's Bird Market by Dikra Rida. Ted Hughes' Bestiary, poems selected by Alice Oswald. Melissa Lee Houghton's Beautiful Girls, a collection of poetry called The Shipwrecked House by Claire Trevian. How to Fall by Karen Anison. A collection of poetry called Propa Propaganda by Benjamin Zephaniah, one of my favourites if you haven't heard me mention before. 40 Sonnets by Don Patterson. Ariel, poems by Sylvia Plath. The Little Book of Vegan Poetry by Benjamin Zephaniah. For the Messengers by Jude Cohen. And one of my all-time favourite poetry collections, and one I highly recommend you start with if you haven't read a lot of poetry, is Hold Your Own by Kate Tempest. Then we come to the bottom shelf on this bookcase, which begins with non-fiction. So let's jump into that, shall we? First we have The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer, which is a kind of memoir inspirational book. The Birth of the Pill by Jonathan Eeg. I Call Myself a Feminist, The View from 25 Women Under 30, edited by Victoria Pepe and a few others. The Bookshop Book by Jen Campbell. Finding Home, Real Stories of Migrant Britain by Emily Dugan. Do It Like a Woman and Change the World by Caroline Criado Perez. The Honour Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen by Kwame Anthony Appiah. Crossing the Sea with Syrians on the Exodus to Europe, Wolfgang Bauer. Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops, and More Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops by Jen Campbell. Men Explain Things to Me and Other Essays by Rebecca Solnit. Arthur Conan Doyle by Don Richard Cox. The Fly Trap. Border Vigils, Keeping Migrants Out of the Rich World by Jeremy Harding. This Book is Gay by James Dawson, which is actually a YA non-fiction, which is just such an excellent concept to me. The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston. This is another memoir. B by Claire Preston. Refusing the Veil by Yasmin Alabai Brown. What Have the Immigrants Ever Done for Us by Kelvin Mackenzie, which honestly I just haven't chalked out yet. I really need to, because it's not good. If we pan to this side, I have 2 books of poetry that escaped the shelf above, and then a collection of fiction novels, all based on ancient times and ancient myths and ancient history. For the poetry, I've got The Complete Nonsense of Edward Lear, which is children's poetry, and The Earth in the Attic by Fadi Judah. And then, like I mentioned, books based on antiquity. We have The Just City by Jo Walton, which is inspired by Plato's Republic. Aphrodite by Isabel Allende or Allende. Rufus by Sarah Walton, which is based in ancient Rome. The Emperor's Babe by Bernardine Evaristo, another one set in ancient Rome. The Walled Orchard by Tom Holt, which is a comedy set in ancient Athens. And the next 3 are all from the Canongate Myth series, and we have a retelling of the myth of Samson, called Lion's Honey by David Grossman. The Helmet of Horror by Victor Pellavin, which is a retelling of the Minotaur myth. Wait by Jeanette Winterson, which is a retelling of Atlas. Love this book. And last but not least is Gore Vidal's Creation.
And that's it. So if you have any questions about the books I showed in this video, just leave them in the comments down below and let me know if you'd like to see the rest of my bookcases.
I then received the numbers 10 and 3 from my friend Brittany over at Under the Radar Books, and this took me to some of my read general fiction, and that was The Secret History by Donna Tartt.